Hi everyone, this is Carolyn with Carolyn Stitches, and I thought I'd take a moment, or probably most of the afternoon, to show you how I sewed my Lizzie Kate Santas into a Sawtooth Star, Sawtooth quilt block square. So I had some requests to show the process, and I figured I'd show it how I did it before I finished sewing the rest of the pieces together. So I showed these on prior video, and these are assortment of Lizzie Kate Santas that I stitched 2018, and they're a little big for ornaments, a little big for pillows, and I wanted to do something with them all together, and I figured let's put them in a quilt block. So this is going to be my method of how I do this. There's plenty of tutorials out there that will show you how to quilt, probably tutorials that'll show you how to make sawtooth squares, how to make flying geese, which I'll get into. But this is my method. This is how I do it. It's probably no means perfect. It's probably not the way other quilters do it, but this is me. This is how I did it. So first, I wanted to decide how big my square was going to be, how big my quilt block was going to be. And at first, I needed to measure my Santas. So I measured the Santas. And I'm sorry I'm doing this in a really weird way. I'll show a picture at the end of my setup. So this Santa is about 5 inches by 4 3/4. Almost 5 inches. So we're going to call him 5 inches square. So he was 5 inches square. I first measured all my Santas to get a rough idea on how big they are. This is another one that's 5 inches square. Let's see here. This one, he's pushing about 4 3/4 of an inch. This guy, oh, he's over 5 inches. He's about 5 1/4. I'd call him 5 1/4. And we got another 5 1/4. So what I'm doing is I'm measuring the design. I'm getting the design of the Santa, and I'm lining up my ruler. So he's about 5 1/2 inches tall, and he's about 4 1/2 inches wide. So I'm just measuring all my Santas just to get an idea of how big they are, because they're all different. This guy, he's about 5 by 5 1/4. And I stitched them all on different fabrics too, so that's why there's kind of not a consistency here. He's about 5 1/4. I'd go with 5 1/2 on him. So you get the point. I measured them, all the Santas, to get an idea. So in measuring all the Santas, that gave me an idea on how I wanted to do the blocks. And I decided I want the center block to be 6 inches finished. I want a 6-inch finished Santa in the center, which I thought gave me enough nice little border around the Santas to really accentuate the Santas. So once I decided I wanted a 6-inch center square, I had to calculate the rest of the quilt block. So that means this piece here is going to have to be 6 inches, and that would have to be 6 inches. This would have to be 6 inches, and that would have to be 6 inches. So if I made this 6 inches, and I want a square block, then these two pieces will have to be 3 inches, the two squares in the corners. So basically I have a 3-inch by 6-inch finished flying geese, and I have 4 of those. And I have 4 3-inch finished corner squares and a finished 6-inch finished center square. Now in order to cut out, to sew this together, you have to add your seam allowance. And in quilting, there is a 1/4 inch seam allowance for quilting. So I had to measure and cut my centerpiece 6 1/2 inches. This was cut out at 6 1/2 inches. The corner squares were cut out at 3 1/2 inches. And my flying geese, unfinished, they will measure 6 1/2 by 3.5. And I'll show you how I made these. There's multiple methods on how to make flying geese. So before I cut out my center square, I first fused it with some fusible interfacing, just to give it a little more body, a little more stiffness. I happen to use a woven fusible interfacing. I don't remember which number it is. It's just whatever I have in my stash. One side is very smooth. The other side is very bumpy. The bumpy side here, that's your fusible side. So I first fused down my interfacing to all my blocks, and I cut them out 6.5 inch square. I cut out my corner pieces 3.5 inch square. And now I'll show you how I made my flying geese. Once again, there are many methods to make flying geese. This just happens to be the one I follow. You can make a method where you cut out all the little individual triangles and sew them together, but to me, you're working on a bias and that stretches. There's another method where you cut a rectangle and you cut squares. You sew, flip, cut off. I always have a problem getting a good point. There's another method where you take a larger square and smaller squares, and you can make 4 at a time, and it's supposed to come out exact when you're done. I don't do that. I still make my flying geese where they're 4 at a time that I make, and they're a little oversized, but I can true them up or cut them down to the correct size, and I always seem to get very accurate points on my flying geese when I do that. So this is how I calculated to do my flying geese. So on a flying geese, you have, or for this calculation, you have your goose. This big triangle is what's considered your goose. And these corners are your background, or the sky. That's how you have to think about it. So my green here represents the sky, and this cream print represents the goose. So once again, I want a 6.5 inch by 3.5 inch flying geese finished at 6 inches by 3 inches. And finished means after I sew all the seams together, this will measure 6 inches, which it does. To start, we need to calculate the size of our goose, because once again, I'm making them 4 at a time. So the size of my goose, I'm going to start with a square piece of fabric. And since I wanted my goose to be 6.5 inches, I take 6.5 inches and I add an inch to it, and I cut out a 7.5 inch square. So this will be my goose. This will be this part of the goose. Now to get my sky of my goose, I take that 7.5 inch square that I cut out and I add an 1.5 inches to it, and I cut out a 9 inch square. Okay, and this is a tutorial that I found on connecting threads, and I can put a link below so you can find it. So once again, a 6 inch by 3 inch finished goose. I want my goose to be 6 inches here, which means I need it to be 6.5 inches to sew them in. So 6.5 inches, I add an inch, I cut out a 7.5 inch square for the goose. For the sky of the flying goose pattern, I add an 1.5 inches to this measurement. So I cut out a 9 inch square for my sky. So what you do is you take your square, your small square, right sides together, and I'm doing this, I got a little bit of a weird setup here, so it's a little awkward for me to do, but you center your smaller square on top of your larger square, okay? And then I draw a line. I draw one line on the diagonal. See if I can do this without knocking over my whole setup. I draw one line on the diagonal. Let's try to get this a little more square, a little more centered. Okay. I'll line it up. And I draw a line on the diagonal. I'm just using a fabric marking pen. You can use whatever kind of marking pen you have, or a pencil. It'll all work. You're not going to see this. So hold on one second. Let me get some pins. One second. I'm not quite prepared. So I got some pins, and I'm going to pin it because I'm now going to take this to my sewing machine and I'm going to sew. Let's pin this first because I don't want it to move. And I'm doing this in a different color because I pretty much made all of these flying geese. So I just used some scrap fabric here to make a different color to show you. So now I'm going to take this to the sewing machine and I'm going to sew a line 1/4 inch away from this side of the line and 1/4 inch away from this side of the line. And I'll be right back. Okay, I'm back from the sewing machine. And you can see I sewed 1/4 inch from that line that I drew all the way down the length. Okay. Take my pins out. Okay. So, I hope this video is going to be okay. I don't normally explain to anybody how I do something. I sit solo in my sewing room and just kind of sew. So it's kind of new to me to explain it, and I don't know. But what we're going to do now is we're going to cut this in half, and you're going to cut it in half on that line that you drew. So take my rotary cutter, I'm going to take my ruler, I'm going to line it up on that line. And if it's not perfect, it's okay. I'm kind of doing this at a weird angle like I said earlier. So I cut it in half. You now have 2 triangles. I'm going to take this to my iron and I'm going to press this, and I'm going to press towards the sky. Remember, this is the geese. This is the sky. We're going to press towards the larger triangle. So let me take this over and press this. Okay, my 2 blocks are pressed. And as you can see, I pressed towards the larger square. I'm pressed towards the larger square. That's how you want to press it. And I pressed both of them the same way. Now, you're going to keep this one right side up. And you're going to turn this one right sides together, because that's the right side, that's the wrong side. And you're going to put them on top of each other. Okay? You're not worrying about matching the seam. As you can see, my seams by no means match up. Okay? You're not trying to match your seams. You want to match the outer edge of the square. That's what I'm trying to match up. The outer edge of the square. I'm not concerned about matching these seams together. Just the outer edge of the squares. And I have it where I have the light color or the goose color touches the background or sky color. And then the light color goose color touches the background or sky color. Okay? And once again, I'm going to pin them. And I use the pins just to hold everything in place. I don't want anything to shift. And I found if I don't have it exactly right on the edge, it's fine, because these come out a little oversized, allowing me to cut them down to the correct size that I need. put the pins just to hold it. And once again, we're going to draw a line. But this time, the line we're going to draw is going to go across the seams. Okay, so we drew our first line and we cut it, flipped them. Now we're going to draw our second line, which will come across the seams here. Okay. And you're going to sew once again a 1/4 inch on each side of that seam or that line. So let me take this over to the sewing machine, get it sewn, and come back. Okay, I sewed a 1/4 inch on each side of the line that I drew. Okay. I'm going to remove my pins. And we are going to cut on that line we drew. Line it up with your ruler, get your rotary cutter, and cut. Two squares. This is what they look like now. Kind of looks like a off-centered hourglass. Now the next step is I will need to cut the seams, but not cut through the seam. So you see here, sorry, I'm rocking my camera. See here where I have this seam? I'm just going to cut real close to it with my scissors, but not go through it. I didn't go through it. I just cut it. And I'm along the other side. Very close. Just snip it. Do the same to this side. And to this side. Okay. Now you need to press. And when I press these, I'm going to press to the red or to my sky, away from my geese. So I'll turn, I'll open this, I'll press this little area here, I'll turn it over, I'll open this up. This is what these little slits are good for. And I'll turn and I'll press this to my sky also. So let me press those. So I pressed to the red, and as you can see, because I clipped those little seams, when I pressed to the red on this side, it made it easier to press because this little seam was clipped and I didn't get some weird rolled seam. And then when I pressed to the red over here, it was already clipped when I pressed to the red this way. So I pressed to the red that way, it was clipped, it made it lay flat and easy. When I pressed to the red on this side, it was clipped and it made it lay easier. On both of them, you can see how that helps. Okay. Now the next step is you're going to cut these in half. Don't be scared. It's easy. We're going to cut this in half. You're going to cut it in half this way. Okay. That ruler's not quite big enough, so let me get a larger ruler and hopefully I can maneuver it with my little confined space here. Like I said, this is a weird setup. I'll take a picture at the end. You can see how weird this setup is. And I don't think that ruler is going to fit. Let's see. Okay. Here we go. Got a ruler. We're going to cut it in half. And when I cut it in half, I definitely want to make sure I'm leaving a 1/4 inch between the tip of that triangle and where I cut, and a 1/4 inch between that triangle and where I cut. So I'm going to try to cut it as straight as possible. And then I have it on the line here, but we'll see. Okay, so I have it lined up on the little dash marks. And I definitely have a 1/4 inch leeway here. It's actually a little more than a 1/4 inch because this here to here, that's my 1/4 inch, and then it's a little over. So I'm good with that. I have it lined up on my little hash marks over here. So I'm happy that it's straight. And I have a little more of a 1/4 inch there. And I definitely have more than a 1/4 inch there. So see if I can cut this. Cut it in half. And you got 2 flying geese. They're not finished yet. And let's cut the other one in half. Okay. Okay, that's more than a 1/4 inch. That's more than a 1/4 inch. Got it lined up. I want to make sure it's straight as possible. I'm still going to square these up, but I don't want it completely off longer. And that's a 1/4 inch. Cut it in half. Okay. So now we're going to take these and we're going to trim them to size. If you were to measure them now, they're about, let's see here, a little over 7 inches. And remember, I need it 6.5. And it's over 3.5. And I need it 3.5. So we're going to square these up. And let's see if I can do this on camera at a weird angle. And I've misplaced my ruler. Okay. So this is my 6.5 inch ruler to me, which makes it easy. I need it 6.5 inches wide. Half of 6.5 is 3.25. So there's my 3.25 marking. This dotted line is a 1/4 inch line. So I'm lining up the peak at the 3.25 inch mark, and I'm making sure that the peak of my triangle is at the, as it has a 1/4 inch seam allowance here. Make sure I'm fairly straight, and we will trim. Okay, trim that away. I'll turn it over. I'll press this little tip, and let me press that little tip and get rid of it. Okay. Which way did I cut that first? Cut it this way, right? Yeah. So 3.25 lined up again. Remember, he's still got trimming over here to do. He's lined up over here on the ruler. We're going to cut that little tip off. It's fine. I got a little off kilter, but that's okay. And then we'll turn it over, turn it around. And I want it to be, once again, the 3.25 mark. Here is my center. And you have the 45-degree lines here that help. So if I line it up on the 45-degree, I still have a 1/4 inch marking here. And trim it up. Now I'm doing this at weird angles, so I normally don't have to go over it this many times, but when you see my setup, you'll see the weird way that I'm doing this, which is not how I normally do it, so we're getting a little off. So this is now 3.5 by 6.5. So you see on my board, lines up to 6.5, and it lines up to 3.5. So continue truing up your geese. Let me do another one. And we'll do this one upside down to start. Might be a little easier. So once again, I went the center of my point on 3 1/4 because I want this 6 1/2 inches finished. The center's 3 1/4. So I'm getting 3 1/4, and I want a 1/4 inch seam allowance here between the tip of the geese to where I cut. You can tell I got it lined up on 3 1/2, and I got this tip on 3 1/4, and I'm just trying to line up my 45-degree lines on my ruler. My 45-degree lines on my ruler. Trim that off. Yeah, it's a little easier doing it this way. And come back around. So now I want it 3 1/2. So it's 3 1/2 and 6 1/2. Okay, so there's my second geese. So far I got 2 geese, and we'll do the other 2. So this has these little tips. You'll find these little tips, just press them, get them out of the way. So I'll do this one. Once again, 3 1/4. 1/4 inch, 45-degree angles, and 1/4 inch. Got a 1/4 inch between the tip and the 3 1/2 inch mark. Put that away. Now we want 6 1/2 inches by 3 1/2 inches. Still want to line up my 3 1/4 there, just so I have it centered. That lines up on that side. Lines up at 3 1/2. Okay. There's your second one, or third one. And one more. This gets a little easier after this. 3 1/4 to the tip. 1/4 inch. That's 1/4 inch hashtag there. So 1/4 inch. Lining up my 45-degree lines. And trim. I need a new blade. This isn't cutting cleanly. When your blade doesn't cut cleanly like that and little pieces stay attached, you just need a new blade for your rotary cutter. So I got the 3 1/2 inch line, 3 1/4 for the tip. Still have a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm lined up on this side. Cut this off. And there you go. So I have 4 flying geese. Now, you lay out your block. Your block is, this is how this will work. We'll use this one as a sample here. We made our flying geese. So that flying goose goes there. This one will go here, there, and there. And remember, you also have your 3 1/2 inch corner squares that you cut out. And that's what you have those for your corners. Okay, so now it's time to sew it together. And when you sew it together, you would sew this square, okay, to that goose. I'll pin it. Okay, so there you go. And then you'll sew this square to that side of the goose. And you'll sew 1/4 inch seam allowance and a 1/4 inch seam allowance, okay? You'll also sew this goose to the side of your Santa with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and this goose to the side of your Santa or your centerpiece, whatever it is, your center square, with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then you'll repeat the bottom like you did the top. You'll sew one of your 1/4 inch quarter squares, 3.5 inch corner squares, and your other 3.5 inch quarter square on the sides to your flying goose, or your, yeah, flying geese, whatever it's called. Okay. Now, I have some of these in various stages. Still using that guy as our sample. Here's the ones you can see. I took my 3.5 inch squares and sewed them to my flying geese. Okay. These are the tops and the bottoms of the stars, and I sewed flying geese to each side of my center square. Now, after you sew it, you need to press it. And I press these a little differently than I would normally press a sawtooth square block that has the flying geese. Normally, on a sawtooth square block with the flying geese, when you press this, you would press towards your center block. So meaning, I would flip this back and I would press my seam towards the center. But because this is kind of thick with the cross stitch fabric and with the interfacing, if I sew it and I press it back towards the center, it gives a very awkward, bulky seam. Like the fabric doesn't naturally want to lay that way. So just for these, I'm pressing it out. I'm pressing it towards the geese. I know not everyone will do it. It's just how I'm doing it on these. So you can see I pressed towards the geese. So my center stays nice and flat. It's slightly bulky here in the center, but I know I'm not going to be quilting anything there or sewing anything further there, so it's fine. But it just makes it lay flat and lay nicer. So because I pressed these out towards the geese, my top squares, I don't want to press them out towards the squares, because if I press them out, I'm going to end up with a very bulky seam there. So these tops and bottoms, I'm going to press in towards the geese, and that way my seam will nestle. Okay. Normally you wouldn't, because you'd have this extra bulkiness here by pressing it to the geese, but I'm finding with this, it's fine. It's, you know, it's fine. Don't call the quilt police on me. It works. Okay, so you sewed your corner squares to your flying geese for the top. You sewed your corner squares to your flying geese from the bottom of the star. You sewed your two flying geese to your Santa or your center square. Now you're going to go to the sewing machine. Let me get some pressed pieces out here. And you're going to take this piece, it's pressed. See, it's pressed towards the inside. Pressed it to the geese. And we're going to pin it. And when I pin it, I'm nestling my seams. You can feel it. When you do it, you'll feel those seams nestle. So you see the seams are matched. So I have my seams nestled. Pin. Over here, my seams will match up. Oops, sorry. Those are nestled. Line it up. And I like to do another pin right in the center tip of the geese. And you can come down here and pin the edges just to hold it in. Okay. Now I'm going to take this sewing machine and I'm going to sew a 1/4 inch seam straight across. Be careful when you're sewing your 1/4 inch seam straight across. That when underneath, you don't want this seam here. So you see how this seam is like? You don't want this seam to get caught in your sewing machine and sew that way. You want to make sure it stays flat. When you come here, you don't want this to get caught by the presser foot and flip backwards. And when you come down here, it's again, you don't want this seam to get caught and, you know, flip backwards. So make sure your seams stay flat. Let me sew this. Okay, I sewed the top strip to my center here. And while I was at it, I pressed it. And I pressed this away from the center because once again, I didn't want that bulk of this fabric with the interfacing. It would have been way too bulky if I would have tried to press it towards the center. So I pressed it away. And you can see my point lines up. This one's a little off. I don't care. This one's perfect. These other two are pretty darn good too, which not bad. It's not going to be in a quilt show. It's not going to be shown fancy. So now we're going to take the last strip here that has the 2 squares and the flying geese, and we're going to pin it to the square. Once again, butt your seams, match your seams up, and you'll feel them when they nestle. You'll feel it. So I'll pin that. Come over here, match my seams. That nestles together. When I've got my edges lined up, I like to put a pin in the center. Come over here, pin the edge. Come over here and pin the edge. So I'm going to, once again, I'm going to sew a 1/4 inch seam across, and be careful not to flip those seams when you're sewing. Okay, here we go. I sewed the bottom on and I pressed it to the outside, or to the flying geese, away from the center. So here's my back. I'm not shy. I'll show you my quilt back, or my quilt block back. All the seams are pressed flat, nothing's twisted. You could probably hear from other quilters, they like to press the seams open. And they probably would, maybe on these flying geese, press the seams open. Once again, I didn't do it with this because it's kind of thick here with this cross stitch fabric. There's really not a lot of bulk there. There's really not a lot of bulk there either. I don't like pressing the seams open because if I was to press this open, there's a chance that I'm going to see the seam from the front on the lighter color fabric. So I always kind of press towards my darker fabrics. But there you go. There's the finished quilt block with the cross stitch in the center. And it should measure 12.5 inches square, which it does. It's 12.5 inch square quilt block. Now when I sew this into the quilt and I add sashing, which is basically fabric I'll sew to the sides to piece the blocks together. Once I do that and it takes in the seam allowance, this will end up 12 inches finished. But right now it's 12.5 inches. So that's how I make a quilt block. That's how I take a cross stitch square and turn it into a quilt block. You can do this with any, you know, look at quilt blocks. Go online, look up quilt blocks. You can find different ideas where a quilt, you know, has a center square and you can do different designs around it. I'm looking through a pattern that I'm working on right now and just pulling out some examples. There's another example of a way you could make a quilt block. You could have your cross stitch in the center, or cross stitch in that cube, that cross stitch in each of these squares, and put the half square triangles around it. Here's like the sawtooth square like we did. you could also go very simple. Just put your cross stitch square in the middle and put some squares around it. Very straightforward, simple, nothing complicated. Or you could go complicated and do like a, I would call that an economy block in the center with almost like bear paws around it. Let's see, give you some more ideas. Got a square like that. Pretty simple, basic, just squares and rectangles. Let's see if I, oh, and here's a nice one that's very simple too. A churn dash. Very simple. Put your cross stitch in the center, and you got just some strips and half square triangles. So there's different ways that you can turn your cross stitch into a quilt block. Go out there, look at the different quilt blocks. There's tons of websites, tons of free websites that have quilt block patterns with instructions on how to make the quilt blocks. And you can figure out a way too to incorporate your cross stitch into your quilting. So I hope you enjoyed this. I'm going to try to go now edit it together, and hopefully it makes sense and I don't ramble too much or get too confusing. Like I said, I'm not used to showing people how I sew or how I quilt. I'm pretty much a solo quilter, and I just sit home and sew. I don't usually have to explain to somebody how I'm doing it. Right now I think we're up to now 7 because I made 1 block with you. I think I'm up to 7 blocks finished. I got 4 more to go. I'm going to throw these, after I get them all sewn, I'm going to throw them up on my design wall. And I'm going to figure out how I want to finish the setting. I have an idea. I just have to sit down and do the quilting math and figure it out. But I'll share the finished quilt when it's done. So I'm not going to do a Flosstube update today. I'm kind of in the throes of Stitch Mania. I still got my last Stitch Mania project to work on, and when I'm done working on that, I'll probably make a video next week with my Stitch Mania, you know, like a Stitch Mania wrap up. But please comment below if you have any further questions, you need clarification on anything. I will put a link to the tutorial that I found or that I use to make these flying geese 4 at a time. I can try to find a link to a tutorial to make a sawtooth square, a 12.5-inch sawtooth square block, which you may find helpful. And I thank you for joining me this afternoon. Once again, please subscribe so you can keep updated on when I do release new videos. And please like and leave any comments below. And I'm going to insert a picture. I'm going to insert a picture. You can see this crazy setup on how I did this. And you probably hear me breathing into the camera. It's like 90 something plus hot, almost 95 plus degrees here in South Florida. It's hot. We've had rain. It's hot. I got a light going on over here off to the side, which is throwing off more heat. Probably hear me breathing into the camera and straining around this, but once you see the setup, you'll understand the craziness in trying to do this. But thank you for joining me today, and just enjoy your stitching, enjoy your long Memorial Day weekend, and I will catch up with you next weekend. Thank you, everyone. Bye. The setup that I was working on today. You can see I have 2 boxes set up with a tripod and my camera. I have my ring light. I got an extension cord going across the room here. All the little extra pieces and props and extra pieces I have kind of set up on my ironing board. So I was trying to finagle around this little setup and box, plus try to make sure I'm getting you in the camera on my cell phone. Oh my gosh, it was crazy. But my sewing area, nice and organized and set up, easy peasy to do the pressing and ironing for each step. But oh man, I give credit to those people who film tutorials. They must have some fancy setups, because this was crazy trying to get the camera up at a good angle for you, get good lighting.